Hello, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. It's a pleasure to be back with you as we're continuing our scholarly Bible study from the Jerome United Methodist Church in Dublin, Ohio Sunday School tradition here. As you all know, when we had to close the church down and stop in-person worship, we started doing these lessons, and we're doing one each week. And we're working our way through the New Testament at this point. What we're going to hit this lesson are the letters that might be from Paul that are called the pastorals, Pastorals. This is 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Now, academically, there's a lot of discussion about these letters. Are these letters genuine Paul letters, or genuine Paul letters in their entirety? And they claim to be from Paul. And people say, well, you wouldn't put that down falsely. In modern life, you'd be violating copyright laws and all that. That's true in a modern situation. However, 2,000 years before, it was not regarded as offensive or larcenous or stealing or anything like that to take a document to which you wanted people to have a lot of respect, or a lot of attention to, and allege it to be written by one of the great church fathers of the time. So actually, even if someone else wrote this and put Paul's name on it, that was a compliment to Paul, not some kind of dishonest thing. It would be as it would be in our current circumstances. So that needs to be understood. What really fuels this discussion is the language, the theme, and even the vocabulary are totally different than the traditional Paul letters. You don't find many of the things from the traditional Paul letters that are emphasized in here in the pastorals, and you find issues in the pastorals that seem to really reflect the church 20 or even 30 years beyond Paul's death. They come from a time where the church appears to be beginning much more bureaucratic, to be dealing with an organizational level, both on the church level and on the local level maybe, that Paul never had to deal with. His churches were so small and so individually run as kind of as a co-op that they really didn't need a leadership position. He doesn't discuss it. These letters deal with leadership positions. They use terms that eventually evolved to mean bishop and pastor. They didn't mean it at the time. So there is a debate, and some of the people who think it has to be Paul letters said, well, probably Paul was released from his imprisonment in Rome and didn't die in 64 under Nero like most people think he did. And he got released and he went off and did more travel, and this was written 5 or 6 or 8 years later. And then he was executed later. That's theoretically possible, but there's no evidence to that. And you have to be careful that you don't get into wishful thinking in the place of scholarly assessment. So I understand there are people who say that, and they say, well, since the church was beginning to evolve, then this would account for that. Personally, I think when you really look at what's the earliest that these issues were beginning to appear in the local congregations, it's probably in the 80s or the 90s of the first century, toward the end of the first century. So you have to try to place it in there in the history of the church. Now remember, with Paul, they were small individual congregations. There was no relationship between the congregations. The church in Corinth knew there was a church in Athens and knew there was a church in Thessalonica, but they didn't really have any relationship with them except when Paul or his followers would visit one and go from one to the other, or they'd raise money for the church in Jerusalem. So they didn't have any need for that kind of administration. And so if you look at this, these are really focused in the heart of the epistles on the administrative aspects of the church. Now, 2 Timothy, if you read it carefully, it looks like the introduction is a genuine Paul introduction, the first chapter. And the latter part of the 4th chapter, which is verses, let me reference here exactly where it is, in the second 2/3 of the 4th chapter of 2 Timothy, that appears to be a genuine Paul closing, because Paul's letters all ended the same way, with a lot of personal references with his various followers and this and that. So what I think happened with but you go to the middle, chapter 2 and chapter 3, it's totally different than a Paul letter, and it's back to these administrative issues. So I think what happened in that one was you had a fragment, or a short letter or a fragment that encompassed the first chapter and the fourth chapter, and someone inserted administrative guidelines in the middle and to put Paul's support on top of it. So that's what I think happens. So when you read these, you'll see that type of flow difference, that 2 Timothy in the end appears more genuine than 1st, and more genuine than Titus, but I think it's simply a fragment which they inserted other things. Remember when we did 2 Corinthians, it appeared to be 2 or 3 Paul letters put together about in the middle, because we made that point that this appears to be an addition of these two things. So when you look at the message, certain of the crucially important Paul issues, salvation through faith, the limitations of the law, and the special mystery of Christ, the divinity and the resurrection, are absent. They're really not stressed in here at all. The issues instead are about instructions about the leadership, how the Christian community is going to behave, who they will select as their elders. These elders, they have a very description. They need to be sober, sedate people, not quarrelsome, not addicted to alcohol, husband of one wife, et cetera, et cetera. So these are very matter-of-fact descriptions of people who should be in the leadership. And they're not incorrect descriptions. We don't really think that's wrong. We do want our leadership to not be misbehaving sexually, misbehaving financially, to be quarrelsome and argumentative or manipulative or any of those things. So the issues are not wrong. It's just that they appear to be about 30 years out of date. Remember that the persecution of the church by the Roman Empire didn't really start till about 90 and 95, probably more like 95, and it was very sporadic. It wasn't a constant thing, and it was very episodic locally. And so the first records we have of it are from about 95 from Western Turkey, when a new governor was sent out by his friend the emperor, and people come and complain to him that these Christians are making a mess out of things. They're not coming to our festivals. They're not buying our idols. They're not doing as much business with us. People who made the idols and ran the ceremonies. Nothing will get somebody angry like you stop using their business and cut into their cash flow. And so the guy examined them, and if they said they're Christians, and then he do capital punishment on them, and he writes his friend the emperor and says, was this correct? And the emperor says, well, seems okay to me, and then earlier he had described what these Christians really do. They meet in the morning in the private homes, they have a meal together, they sing hymns and they say prayers. They're not making trouble for anybody. They're not breaking the law. They're being very law-abiding. So the emperor said, but don't go looking for them. Basically what he's saying is leave them alone. So any smart Christian of that era would be like a smart Christian in China right now. You want to lie low, practice your faith, not get in the face of the government and bring them down on you. So the Christians behaved themselves in the culture at that time. And they were well-behaved people who were deeply in, we have to love each other, etc. And so, they weren't perfect, of course, none of us are. So that issue doesn't show up either, so it probably dates it into the 85 range before that type of persecution had begun. So the major Paul issues are absent. Not a lot of complaint about the Judaizers, and there again about proper leadership of the Christian community, the issues about that are several decades after Paul's death, etc. And they deal with local organizations. They use the term episkopoi in Greek, which becomes bishop, but people don't think that it really means bishop at this time, that there was no evidence of local administration until early into the 2nd century. 110, 120, they began to organize locally. And the term presbyter becomes the term for priest, but they didn't have an official ordained type priesthood at the time. So those are terms in evolution, but so that probably puts it in the time frame between 85 and 100. we want to, in the First Timothy, he talks about several specific issues. He talks about a liturgical prayer, that you should have a regular liturgical prayer where you pray. He doesn't say what the prayer is. It could be something like our Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed is so old, nobody can date it. We don't know when and where it started. It probably is something like that as a liturgical prayer, so that there would be a recitation of what the community believed. And he had a very important point. Don't alienate the Roman authorities. That's always good advice. Like I said earlier, their approach to the Roman Empire was like the approach of a Chinese Christian to the Chinese government. Let's lie low. We won't make trouble for them, and hopefully they won't make trouble for us, because the Roman Empire could have squashed them if they wanted to. The male leadership definition is appropriate: a sober, thoughtful, generous, not harsh, not angry, not addicted to wine, husband of one wife type of person. But when you get into the roles with women, you'll see a complete transformation from the role of women in Paul's time, 55 to 60, into the role of women now 30 years later. What's happened is the church has become much more institutional and has adopted a lot of the cultural conservative aspects that churches have had for a long time, and the role of women, which had been on a parity basis back in Paul's time. He mentions Prisca and Aquila, where the wife is mentioned ahead of the husband. He talked about Lydia, who was one of his main followers, who was a seller of purple luxury goods, a wealthy person by that kind of definition. But here, women are relegated to a secondary role, very clearly a secondary role. So it's much more relevant to a much more established church, rather than the church has begun to evolve into a traditional community type situation with much more structure to it and much more control about it. And so this, when very conservative churches in our era are looking to keep women in a secondary role, or women can't be teachers, they can't be ordained, they can't this, they'll go to these letters, which are not from the early Christian movement, but from a much later evolution, 60 years after the resurrection. And when people question the role of women, I ask them who the principal witness to the resurrection was. The women, Mary Magdalene. So, the role of women should be continued. And Paul had no problems with women having prominent roles, as we said about Prisca and Aquila, etc. So, it's a much more of an evolution than it is anything else. The male leadership should be sober and calm and sedate and all that. He does have a warning in 1 Timothy about false teachings. And these false teachings appear to have no marriage and a strange diet. No one really knows exactly what this false teaching is about. It's not the tradition of the Judaizers, the people who wanted to follow the law. People think it's the beginning of the Gnostic movement. The Gnostics, spelled Gnostics, were a strange hodgepodge group that pulled religious icons and figures from other cultures and kind of blended them into one kind of made-up religion. And so they would incorporate all sorts of things, and they tried to incorporate Jesus into this. And they became a threat in the second century, in the 100 to 250 range. Then they faded away. But apparently they had no marriage, and they had this unusual thing. So this appears to be a reference to the Gnostics as they were beginning to evolve. Then there's a lot of very specific instructions for how the churches are to behave. A long discussion about widows in the church. Remember, there were no social services available in the Roman Empire at all. Many church historians think one of the reasons that the churches grew so rapidly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the 100 and 200, was that there was no social structure to offer any kind of charity, welfare, personal support, guidance, anything like that in the Roman Empire. You were just on your own. And the churches would provide that. They would feed the hungry. They would take care of you if you were homeless. They would incorporate people there. And so the discussion on widows that's in there it's part of that development of this. It's evolving and developing, and it becomes much more significant in the next 100 years. But he says, the person who wrote this, he said, if the widows are elderly and they have no family to support them, then the church conference needs to take them in. That means above 60. That's really old in those days. If they're younger widows, then there's this big push, they need to get married again. The person who wrote this did not like having unmarried women around. So I think if you have a very severe attitude toward women, then you want them all married off and they become the husband's problem. But there's a very long push that the younger widow should remarry. And if the widows have family who can care for them, children, grandchildren, cousins, then they're supposed to do it. But the church is supposed to take care of the older women who don't have any support that way. Because remember, it was very difficult for women to survive in the early Roman Empire. They did have some opportunities, but it really was very difficult. Right at the end, there's an interesting quote, which is a little problematic for the Methodists. It says, "Drink a little wine for your digestion." I smile at this. I don't drink alcohol at all. Wesley, of course, saw what a terrible problem with alcohol and the people to whom he ministered in 18th and 19th century Britain. And so Methodist Church is supposed to have no alcohol whatsoever, but it's interesting, the contrast here. I've always said that that the alcohol prohibition and the gambling prohibition are not scriptural, they're cultural. And I agree with them, but having seen a lot of alcohol problems in my life, but it's in there. And they have another great quote, which is a saying that was passed around at the time. It's not unique to Timothy, even though it's in there. And it says that the love of money is the root of all evil. And boy, did he nail that one. But if you go back and read the Gospels, Jesus talked far more about the evils of money than he ever did about the evils of sex. People think that sexual misbehavior was the dominant thing in Jesus, and it wasn't to Jesus. What he really preached about is you can't love God and money. So it's still an issue now. It's very interesting that people duck this one in modern churches. They really don't say, hey, you've really got to control your greed to really be effective. And of the 7 deadly sins in the traditional church, greed is one of them. Lust is one, and sloth and envy and anger and can't remember all, gluttony. Yeah, that's my other big one. Pride. Pride is the big one. It's interesting how we just don't talk about it when it's really there. Now, 2 Timothy chapter 1, I said, seems very much to be a Paul opening, and chapter 4 from verses 6 through 22 seems very much like a classic Paul discussion at the end. I'm going to try to come see you, and I'm in prison here, and it has a similar vocabulary. In chapters 2 and 3, the message becomes much more of the culturally conservative message, like in 1 Timothy, about how you set up the church. And these messages have become relatively traditional. You avoid philosophical discussions, no quarrels. Fine, that's fine with me. Stand firm with uprightness. I don't disagree with any of these. Have faith and love and peace, and it continues to have some caution to them about the last days, about evil people coming, etc. So these things, the comments are not out of line or inappropriate. They're just not typical for Paul. It talks about expecting persecution and trying to live with the upcoming persecution, trying to live for Christ. So this may reflect the persecutions that are beginning in the mid-90s in the Western Turkey area. It's not entirely clear. No one really knows a lot of these things. You're just forced to look at it and try to put it in the context and make sense of it. Titus is quite similar. I can also don't suspect Paul authorship of Titus. It's very concerned with church administration. Episcopoi, the term that became bishop, which just really means church leader at this time, is widely used in Titus. And again, the personal qualities are personal morals, never arrogant, never hot-tempered, not greedy, calm and upright. I mean, things that are appropriate for church leadership at this point, because controlling your evil qualities inside a congregation is very difficult, but it's very important also. There is some condemnation of the Judaizers, of the people that wanted to go enforce the law, where you had to have the dietary laws and be circumcised and all that. But that's it's kind of a passing mention, only anywhere in the pastorals, the three pastoral epistles. It's a long list of personal qualities that are good, and they are good: reserved, dignified, moderate, respectful of elders, free of scandal or gossip, not addicted to wine. Again, these are more conservative cultural values that have crept into the church 30 years after Paul's time, because the church is larger, it's more established, has more recognition in the society, and therefore you want it to look good for the society around it. That slaves are to be obedient. Again, we talked about this. And the church is to be obedient to people in authority. Again, cautioning them, don't tangle with the Roman Empire. And that's very good advice for the Roman Empire. Being uncompromising in your teaching, avoid quarrels. But it's an interesting thing in Titus. If you have a dispute with someone, try to resolve it once. If you have a dispute with that person a second time, then basically shun them, cast them aside. Kind of a harsh thing to say. I understand you don't want to have these disputes that tear up modern churches, and we're not going to go down the list, but it's very typical. But it's kind of an unforgiving approach to say basically cast them aside and shun this. So that's kind of the summary, and the point I would like to make is as you read this, read it to understand where it fits in the context of the Christian church development. It's not in the early Jesus following in Galilee. It's not in the early Paul missions where he was just trying to convince people that the concept of a life after death, Jewish Messiah who came to save us from ourselves and forgive us of our sins, and a single God who loved us, that's been put aside, and now you're seeing all these administrative things. So I don't have any problem with the administrative things, except I think the subjugation of women and slaves is just not appropriate and not relevant for modern life. But many of those things really don't go back to the role of the church and Jesus in Galilee or the early Christian movement at the era of Paul, which is 45 to 65. So it's not that these are unuseful or incorrect in certain things, but they really shouldn't, in my opinion, carry the weight of the Gospels with Jesus' words and of the early Paul letters as the true chosen emissary of God to carry Christianity through the civilized world. So this is Dr. Guthrie, and this will finish our look at the Paul letters. Next week we'll go into what's probably my least favorite of the epistles, which is Hebrews. We'll see how I do with this. I'll do the best I can, being human like the rest of us. So thank you very much.